Hello, beautiful, and welcome to the podcast where we're moving the conversation forward about the choices you make in your daily life. I'm your host, Monica Cox, and I'm here right alongside of you, learning, growing, observing, and trying to make better choices consciously and subconsciously. Together, we're going to become better versions of ourselves and have raw, honest, open conversations about the things that truly affect our lives. And maybe, just maybe, finally get to a place where everyone else's BS doesn't trigger us.
And I can guarantee you, if the next referendum came around in 10 years' time around voting yes or no, there would be a lot more people that would vote.
Yeah. And did you experience, like, we're not going to call anyone out, but do you experience other Commonwealth people who maybe had never lived in the UK, but were like, yeah, Brexit, I'm so for it, like the British?
Well, I mean, this is where, in my personal opinion, like, a lot of Trump's political currency, was garnered from. It's this whole
Yes.
jingoistic thing, right? And that's been used in politics forever. Anytime there's a problem, you point to the foreigner. That's happened, with the Irish in the UK and, through all of the various other areas. And even obviously in the US, in its formative years, anytime there was a problem, you pointed to the minority and started saying they were the outsider. And they were able to create, a real partisan approach between both of the yes votes.
You know what's funny here in the US now is that the Democrats always had, this open border policy, right? So a lot of people come in, and I'm not here to debate if it's right or wrong, but you have generations now who were born or grew up only in America and have a very different view on the border system. And so the Democrats are actually losing a large majority of the Hispanic vote because they're like growing up and going like, well, no. It can't just be fully open. We need to have some kind of boundary, some kind of way. And I also believe this, let's get the tin hat out for this one, but I think that some of them saw what happened during these border crossings. And I think they can see between the lines that maybe not all, but there's a portion of very not nice, very corrupt things of why you would have open border policies in the first place. So I think there's this big generation that sees it from a very different point of view, which is huge because that kind of I wouldn't even say by the border anymore. You go up to Northern California and you half the people around you are speaking Spanish, which I don't have a big issue with at all. And it's just like very interesting that it's changing the whole dynamics of the left-leaning party. And yeah, they're showing up in different ways.
But that then is this idea of like populism, right? Which kind of comes back to this idea of career politicians and marketing, the role of marketing in politics. If you're searching for power now in our current societal, across a number of different countries, if you're searching for power and that's your bag and you want to be part of a political party, or you're in a political party and you're not doing so well, how do you start getting media? How do you start getting political currency? You start calling out things on the fringes, right?
And I think the other thing too, and this is like a question for all of the countries, do you think that traditionally you stayed in the party that your family, that like whatever you grew up in, right? So like in America, a lot of your politics, you obviously grew up in this house where people were talking this, and this, and then you just became that as well. Just like your religion or, whatever your belief system was, where there's this huge shift with the younger generation that is like, like almost like going completely against the grain and like, oh no, I don't identify like that. And it's okay to do that, where before it might not have been. Do you think that's the same in different countries that you've seen?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I can talk from my own experience. My dad was so right wing, or he still is. His dad worked on the waterfront in Auckland in New Zealand, and he was like an organizer for the union, and participated in the waterfront strikes, and was a big part of that whole movement. And Dad has constantly talked about if we ever voted for the right, that my grandfather would roll over in his grave, like that's so it wasn't a bipartisan household by any stretch of the matter. And I think as soon as you got, and maybe education is part of the key, as soon as I became educated and read a lot and started to see different things, I started to see that there was no one ideological that suited me. And it was more of a case of, okay, well, what do they think about this, and what do they think about that? In terms of social policy and supporting people who are lower socioeconomic status and lower educated, and you can look at a whole bunch of statistics in terms of facts and figures and see that impacts certain communities more often than others. I'm totally for supporting those things. But equally, there's certain economic policy that I would disagree with some of the left sides as well. But yeah, I think there is that shift for sure. And I think it's people are bringing more of their direct relationships with things into some of their political ideals. I mean, we can shift across to Sweden now, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely.
In our political whistle stop tour. Sweden has seen a massive shift towards the right, and partly driven by immigration as well. And it's no surprise that the Sweden Democrat Party, which is the major right wing, who basically built their party around immigration, have now become the second biggest party in Sweden. And people are horrified by that. They've actually got like roots, their entire roots from not that long ago, like maybe 20 years, 25 years ago, was as a Nazi party. They were a white supremacist party. Now, clearly, they've softened themselves around the edges, and they've gone through all of these marketing campaigns to show themselves that they're not that anymore, and that they often talk about that. But the reality is that there's still a number of key figures in that party today that were in that party then, and probably haven't really changed their thinking. But the immigration issue has become such a big one here in Sweden because of its links to crime and its links to causing societal issues that are everywhere around. Now, some of it isn't true and some of it is true. And part of the problem that Sweden has had, I think, is not actually owning some of the issues that they cause themselves. And the root of it was really around when the Syrian crisis hit, I think they took somewhere around about 250,000 refugees, which is a phenomenal amount of people, if you think about that. Yeah. And the idea behind it was amazing, right? There was a huge upheaval in that country. A lot of people were struggling. And Sweden said, you know what, we will help them out. We have the land, and they clearly do. There's a lot of space here. The problem was they didn't have the infrastructure to support that many refugees. And it's no surprise, and I've had direct relations with a number of Syrian refugees in terms of various employment programs and stuff, and been able to work in here and understand their story. It's no surprise that when you understand the conditions that they were forced to live in when they came, that very quickly they would stop being grateful that they're out of their war zone, and you start to focus on the things that we all focus on, which is, how am I going to support my family? How are my kids going to get educated? How do I build a home and a life for myself? And what about all my other family dotted around the world? So through that, there's created a lot of issues there. And that's where the Sweden Democrats came in. Now, the interesting thing with the Swedish political system is that they have an election once every 4 years. Theirs is kind of similar to New Zealand in the way that you almost vote for the party. You don't actually, you do vote for individuals, but it's more of like a preference vote for that individual. You're not actually voting someone to represent you in a geographical location. So the main part of it is that you're voting for a party. And then once they assemble all those votes, then they go about the process of deciding who can govern. Now, the crazy thing that they do here is that all of these parties kind of join together and create like what they call them these blocks. So there's like a left block and a right block. They're not one party, but they all have different things and they campaign on completely different stuff, right? And then when they get in power, even though they're part of the block, all of what they basically campaigned on kind of goes out the window, essentially. And then they figure out what they can try and do together. So they all get voted in and people vote for the party based on very specific individual policies that never will come to fruition because they have to give away all of those things when they join into this coalition. The fascinating thing about the last election was the fact that the party that got the most votes, which is the Social Democrats, so that's left leaning, they had like 30% of the vote. They're not part of the government. They had 10% more of the vote than the next biggest party, and they are not part of government. Okay, so you're talking about thinking about how you get represented because their parties and their bloc did really bad this time. Yeah. Now this is where it gets wild. In the right bloc of parties, the Sweden Democrats that I talked about before, who were basically the ones who have campaigned on immigration, and they're really popular now. They got 20 point something percentage of the vote. So they were the second biggest party now in the country. But they chose not to be part of government. They decided that even though they were the second biggest, they're not the ones leading the government either. And we can come to the motivation behind that in a second. So the third biggest party, and then its members of blocs, form a minority government with an agreement with the Swedish Democrats around supply and demand in terms of they will support them on certain core issues so that they can run government, things like finance and social welfare and what have you. So the whole thing becomes really like a clusterfuck, to be honest. Like, and it takes forever for them to come up with ideas around who can govern and who does what and how they do it. And the party that's governing got like the third most amount of votes, but they're now the ones leading the country, which as a voter, and it was because I became a citizen, it was the first election I could vote in. I was just lost, like looking at it, because I just assumed the Sweden Democrats would be, and they're like, oh no, no one wants them in parliament, and they don't want to be in parliament. And I'm like, well, why wouldn't they want to be in parliament? And ultimately, it's because they don't want to be accountable for any of the decisions that the government makes. So this party basically can sit outside of parliament for the entire 4 years, campaign against the ruling government that they support and against the opposition, and continue to hold their voter base without ever getting tested on anything that are any of their policies. It's wild, man. Like, it's wild as a system.
Does it work?
I mean, it does, of course, because there's rule and law, and but I guess it comes back to this point of what difference is it making? Who's leading us? Because whether this party's in there or whether that party's in there or whether this party chooses to be in or not, everything keeps going on.
Yeah.
And I think it kind of lends to this idea of like, well, who actually is running the country then? What are the things that we're not seeing and we're not voting on that are defining policy, that are, implementing that policy and that are governing things? It kind of strikes to the heart, I guess, of why I think the Swiss model is best, because it starts to introduce this idea of where you've got anything that is a major change to your country. And they've got, quite clear classifications around that. you get to vote on that.
Yeah.
As an individual, and it's completely different. But yeah, the Swedish one is wild in my opinion. And then the other kicker is if a party gets in, then they, unless an individual has got 5% of the entire vote that they've been voted for, they don't have to potentially be a member of parliament. So the party just chooses pretty much whoever they want to be in whatever positions they want. So even more, you're not even voting for an individual to represent you. And it's crazy, man, because they have like 18-year-olds that are in parliament. And, you could argue maybe that's a good thing or not, but there's some wild things that happen with regards to that. So for me, looking at that and then realizing that, okay, actually has a lot changed since these guys got in with all of that clusterfuck of, voting and who did what and who's going with who. No, it didn't really, which means something else is going on, I think, that ends up, the actual system that's running the government. That's a lot to take in, but yeah, it's wild.
What comes up for me is, maybe another tin hat, but it's an illusion. It's like the Romans always pop up into my head, give them what they want. And, and here in Hawaii, the fireworks here are insane. The corruption to get, and I'm talking billions worth of fireworks in for New Year's Eve, right? And all year round, fireworks just pop off almost every single day here. It's what level of corruption needs to happen to allow that much illegal substance, into, and then just be so blatantly obvious, right? There's no hiding. It's not like the crackhead on the street, and I was in an Uber with a local and it was around the time. And so I was asking, I was like, well, how do you get it? He's like, oh, I'll tell you, I'll hook you up. It was so funny. But I bet you the moment, and this is the same with Brexit, the moment if someone was zero fireworks, people wouldn't give a shit. Right? But it's that distraction of illusion of you do have a choice. And I feel a lot of Americans feel that way of well, my vote doesn't matter. And is it set up in this system of well, when you quote unquote wake up, or if you care enough to look at what's really going on, do you realize that there is this wizard behind the curtains really running the show, and you as the minion, it doesn't really truly matter? And if that is the case, how do you get enough people to care enough to make that massive change? And I feel that's what drives me to want to talk about these things on a podcast, share on social media, even though I will say I know very little. Maybe I know more than the common person, but next to a political scientist, I don't know shit. I don't.
And that point actually is really good in terms of linking into Switzerland, because I was talking with two Swiss citizens today about their model in Switzerland, and again, to canvas everything. No system is perfect, and I'm sure there would be people that say this system doesn't work, but the potential of this, I think, is great, and they were very, very pro it. So basically, Switzerland's what's called a direct democracy, caveat with representative democracy, or a semi-direct democracy. And what that means is that there is much more engagement from a citizen perspective with key policies that the government wants to implement. Now, of course, all of those key functions of state, say police and education and monetary policy and all of those kind of things, there's an elected body, so they elect people similar to kind of this MMP model in New Zealand, where people are in parliament and then they have to do the work of government to make things happen. But anytime that there's a level of importance, and it's very well defined, then they have to then put that vote to a referendum where every kind of citizen, and understands very clearly like it's their direct duty on these referendums. Interestingly, the actual voter engagement, and that's something we haven't touched on, which is fascinating to look at, but the voter engagement when they're electing their representative people is, 50%, which is probably on par with a lot of democracies in the world. But their actual engagement when it comes to the referendums is way higher because people understand the importance of like what these actually referendums do. And it's super interesting to look at. Any citizen can challenge a law and propose a modification. And there's a number of different categories around how they call it. One, there's like a federal initiative where you'd need 100,000 signatures, and then it would basically get into being part of this referendum. Now, the people in government obviously help draft the proposals and do all of that. But one of the interesting things that my friends talked about was that they get a lot of information that is in plain speak around what it means, what the impact will be, and giving you enough information. And there's forums where you can engage and ask more questions, and then all of that information is provided publicly as well. And they've talked a lot around how that information gets distributed. They still distribute it by paper because they understand, even though a lot of the world is digital, not everyone is, and they want to make sure that they get a lot of that information out. There's what's called like an optional optional kind of decree or whatever, and that's 50,000 signatories. So that's obviously a little bit lower threshold, but it's not as important in terms of the level and the impact. And then they have what's called a mandatory, which is what the government then proposes. So yeah, say you wanted to do Obamacare as an example, in a big kind of healthcare change, then that would get put to the people to be able to vote on the different aspects of it. And from my perspective, it's kind of, how do we get people engaged? And some people would say, well, look at Brexit or look at various other things where referendums have happened. People don't care anyway, and people don't read the stuff that gets sent out, and they're not engaged. Look at the voter turnout. But from my perspective, I think you have to start somewhere, and you have to have a more optimistic view that if you do start providing some of this information and you do start showing people that if they don't vote, that there is an impact. And I think, as I mentioned before, I think everyone in the UK would absolutely turn out en masse for a similar type of vote like Brexit, given the huge impact it has had on them. Mm-hmm. And if you think about the Swiss model where people are constantly, so they have 4 referendums a year. So it's not like, you're getting something through every 5 seconds, vote on this, vote on that, vote on this. It's very structured. Everyone knows within the year, referendum 1, 2, 3, 4, the information is going to come out at a certain time. It's publicized very well. If you're giving people that level of information and then they start to see the impact of it, then they're going to start feeling more connected. And that's a hopeful view, and maybe other people might be more cynical, but I honestly believe that people would become much more engaged with everyone around them if they could start to have those types of discussions and then see their vote matter.
Absolutely. I mean, 2 things come up for me. In California, they voted to not have a time change during the seasons, and it passed. Californians chose, we do not want to change, fall forward, no, spring ahead, fall back. And they didn't keep to it. They were like, nah, that's not really what we want as a government for whatever fucking reason. I don't know. Yeah. And I think most states you can have that where the people actually did vote and then their vote didn't matter. They didn't change it. So I think there's a lot of delusion in that. But then I also say, in my practice of, health and wellness and mindset, is that people only start to make change or will want better for their life when the bullshit gets too much. And I think that the US government and maybe other governments too have made it where it's a cushy life, and it's a rat race as well. And people just aren't willing. I can only use my school, for example. They are struggling to get parent volunteers. And I can list you 10 reasons why. And I say that out loud to them. Don't want to hear it. Both the governing body don't want to shift the way they do things. And so the parents are like, well, don't give a shit, not going to help. And I think you can put that directly into politics too. You know, they just, we have a crosswalk right in front of the school, and no one mans it. In any other country, you would have like 2 lollipop ladies, like vests, everything. No one wants to touch it. The city won't touch it. The school won't touch it. Someone died on the crosswalk last year, still not going to touch it. And it just, like I've had to calm my nervous system around it because no one's doing anything about it. Why do I keep showing up to these meetings? They're just for show. Because you just want to show face, oh, rah, 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 and then nothing happens. And I can see why people are just like, well, I tried, and they did put in some effort, and no one's listening to me. So what's the point? But yeah, so I guess, you know, to wrap this whole conversation up, we're all moving to Switzerland.
Unfortunately, it's incredibly expensive to live.
Yes.
And then you need to know like German, French, and Italian, and Swiss German. So there's a slight.
And I'm sure their immigration policy is
very tight. They're very tight. The neutral Swiss. But yeah, I thought it was a fun way of having a look at a number of different options that are out there and seeing where there's, you know, potential flaws in a lot of them, some positives and some of them. But equally, I think we often don't think that there's something different. And I think it's good and I'm sure there's other models out there from a number of your listeners probably know of a number of other models out there that maybe differ slightly from these also. But I really feel that in order to get people engaged in this kind of stuff, you have to have much more of an opportunity to see your vote making a difference. Otherwise, I agree totally with you. I think that we are constantly just going to be on to the next football training, on to the next, you know, basketball, rugby training, work, we're going to work overtime, we're going to go buy groceries, we're going to do all of this stuff. Our kids are sick, we need to look after them. And to your point, I think by creating that apathy, it absolutely serves the purpose of those who are currently in power and ruling, right? Because they know that there won't be any kind of rapid shift and change that will impact them and this kind of ironclad system that they've built, where, you know, in essence, you're just shifting a number of the same actors into the same seats. And I think it's interesting because we point fingers at a lot of third world countries, and we hear about dictatorships, and we hear about kind of religious rule and how oppressive it all is, and how terrible it is for all of the people. And absolutely, there is some terrible practices that go on. But there is a lot of commonality that we have with regards to the actual power we have as people to influence things. There's a very direct, clear level of power we have, and we enjoy in Western countries over many, many millions and millions of people around the world when it comes to our own lives and the freedoms we have. But how that translates to actually who is in power, how we can affect society, we've been pushed down to really just focus on our own micro lives. And I understand that we spend most of our time doing that. But yeah, the idea around how things are actually happening above us and how we're getting manipulated within that, I think is lost on a lot of us.
Yeah, definitely. It's very interesting to be the observer in these times and still, you know, figuring it out for yourself as how do you move as a single human being in this time when you know that the wider collective is in control, but doesn't have that realization yet. And it kind of goes back to Abigail and I went off on a tangent of the whole COVID situation. It was very black and white, very simple, that they took away your means. right? Do this and then you can have this back. Don't do this and you can't feed your family. You can't
Mm,
pay your rent. And that's what it was. Yes,
mm,
there was a certain aspect of public safety for a portion of it, but the grand scheme of thing, now that we can all sit back and really look at it, and that was it. People don't want to get uncomfortable. You know,
mm,
people aren't willing to live in their car. You know, like, fuck it. Okay, you want me to live outside of my truth. I'll just go sleep in my car, or I won't go out to eat, or whatever it was. And I think that's the thing. And there's very little personal responsibility on so many different levels. And I do think it comes back to people not having the capacity um to care, whether
mm,
it's they don't have the time, they don't have the means, or they don't have the health. When you don't have your
mm,
health, you don't feel like doing anything, and you just
mm,
get in those cycles of eating
mm.
like shit, drinking, whatever it is. And
But that's the
like,
thing, like if you, and that's, coming back to that Swiss model, if you had the ability to impact the policies
mhm,
around that, right?
yeah,
Like I truly believe you would become more engaged if you had the
absolutely.
ability to limit the amount of sugar that goes into stuff. If you
Hmm.
had the ability to limit the way that animals are treated, and the drugs that are pumped into animals, and able to regulate that. And that's, in the US, as an example, is done by a body that's not elected, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and you start unraveling all of that stuff of all of these political bodies that aren't actually elected. Yeah, I mean that's another conversation, I
Yeah,
suppose.
definitely. I think the thing is, and what I've always kind of, even before I feel like I gained awareness, I've always felt like all great empires fall. That's a very easy lesson you can learn from history class. Like, I didn't particularly enjoy history, but I definitely got that out of out of history, is
I
that
love history.
every every great empire falls, and
Yeah.
every great empire was built on slavery.
Mm,
So that's just, are we going to be alive to see it? Are we going to live through that history? And who's going to write the history books for the
mm,
future generation to learn from? Because
mm,
I feel like we didn't learn shit.
mm. Right. I mean,
Yeah.
as kind of a final point, the political powerful have got smarter as well as time has evolved, right? How do you stop people from, when all of those empires have fallen? It's generally been to a point where the corruption or the abuse of the people that they're governing has got to such an extent that they can't bear it anymore, right? And therefore, you've got the uprising where you've got other people coming to take what you want. I think where, for all of those things that you've just described of why we are apathetic today, is that people are smart now. They realize, what are the things that we need to give? Yeah. What are the things that we need to allow, in order to keep the population and society in the perfect little spot where we
Yeah.
can continue to make the billions and billions of dollars that we make.
And on this final note, which is really ironic, is so in America, they put in this bill to ban TikTok and like passed it like super quick, right? But they was also in this bill for a bunch of foreign aid for different wars and countries in wars. The amount of people who now know how American politics work because of TikTok is through the roof.
Wow.
And it's just like, you know, I feel like, for lack of a better word, evil and the power gets so big and it eventually fucks themselves over, right? And I just don't think they realized with TikTok that if you take away what the people want, you are going to expose yourself. So all these people are like, I didn't know bills were like made like that, and they literally learned something about politics. And I was just sitting there going like, oh, this is beautiful to watch this unfold. Brad, it's always such a pleasure to have you on. I'm sure we're going to have you again. Good luck with your thesis and all the amazing stuff that you're doing. Like I said last time, you're not on social media, so you can't find Brad. But one day when your book is published, we'll put the link down below.
No, for sure. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been super fun and really interesting talk. The final quote that I always deliver when I talk about democracy and politics comes from the smartest people, I think, in terms of commenting on it, which is the people who create The Simpsons. Kent Brockman, the newsman on The Simpsons, in response to Homer winning an election, turns to the camera and says, "I've said it before and I'll say it again. Democracy doesn't work."
Thank you so much again for joining us here on Choices. You can go ahead and leave a 5-star review because we're all friends here. But if you really want to move the conversation forward, please connect with us on our social media accounts, which you can find the links below. Have a beautiful week, and we'll see you next time here on Choices.